She thought her career was over when her boss heard the humiliating voice note she sent, but instead of firing her, the icy millionaire pulled her closer than she ever imagined. Hello, my friends. Before we begin this amazing story, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and how your day is going, all right? And don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. The crystalline spire of the Shard glittered against the bruised twilight of the London sky, a silent, indifferent monolith to the city's relentless ambition. But inside the sprawling open-plan office of Nexus Innovations on the 32nd floor, a cold sweat was trickling down Olivia Parker's spine, each icy drop a testament to the catastrophic implosion of her career. Her finger hovered, trembling, over the unsend button on her smartphone's screen, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird beating its wings against a cage of bone. It was a useless, desperate gesture, a prayer to a digital god who had long since forsaken her. It was too late. The two tiny, malevolent blue ticks confirmed it with brutal finality. The voice note had been delivered and listened to. The one where, fueled by 2 lunchtime glasses of Sauvignon Blanc and the raucous encouragement of her friend Sarah in a noisy Soho pub, she had gleefully and in excruciating detail described Victor Vance, the firm's notoriously icy director of strategy. He's a walking statue of a Greek god. Honestly, if that god's only personality trait was judging your font choices with extreme prejudice, her voice, tinny and overly loud, had chirped in the recording. He's got this jawline that could cut glass and these eyes that just pierce right through you. Utterly stuck up, completely unapproachable, but so devastatingly, infuriatingly hot, it should be illegal. The silence in her headphones was now a roaring vacuum, broken only by the frantic, percussive thumping in her own ears as Victor's glass office door, a mere 50 feet away across a sea of desks, began to slowly, silently swing open. The next morning felt less like the start of a new day and more like the grim continuation of a very public execution. The journey on the Central Line was a suffocating blur of anonymous limbs and the screech of metal on metal, each lurch of the carriage a nauseating reminder of her plummeting future. Walking into the gleaming, minimalist lobby of Nexus Innovations was like presenting herself for judgment. The air, usually buzzing with the kinetic energy of a tech-driven hive mind, felt heavy with whispers and furtive glances. Olivia could feel the weight of them, 100 tiny pinpricks on her skin, as she made the long, agonizing walk to her desk. This was the world she had fought so hard to enter, a world of sleek glass walls, panoramic views of the Thames, and people who spoke with the easy, inherited confidence of expensive educations. She, Olivia Parker, from a working-class family in Reading, had always felt like an imposter here, a fraud perpetually on the verge of being discovered. Her humor was a shield, her creative chaos a defense mechanism against the crippling fear that she simply wasn't good enough, wasn't polished enough, wasn't one of them. She had spent 2 years trying to prove her worth, to secure a permanent senior role that felt impossibly out of reach. Now, thanks to one mortifying 47-second voice note, she hadn't just been discovered. She had lit a bonfire on top of her own career and was waiting for the smoke to clear so they could identify the ashes. Her dread was a coppery taste in her mouth, a constant, low-grade hum of anxiety that made it impossible to focus on the market analysis report shimmering on her screen. Her gaze kept drifting towards the glass cage at the corner of the floor, Victor Vance's office. He was in there, a silhouette of sharp angles and controlled stillness against the London skyline. He hadn't said a word to her yet, which was somehow infinitely worse than being yelled at. The silence was a coiled snake waiting to strike. As if on cue, a shadow fell over her desk. "Parker," a voice oozed, dripping with false bonhomie. It was George Ballard, a rival project manager whose ambition was as sharp and unpleasant as his pointy designer shoes. He leaned in, his smile a predatory slash. "Heard you've been making some bold internal communications. Takes guts to be that transparent with senior management." His words were a thinly veiled jab, a public twisting of the knife she had already plunged into her own back. He saw her as an incompetent amateur, a joke, and this was his moment to relish it. "Just trying to keep things interesting, George," Olivia managed to reply, her voice tight, forcing a smile that felt like cracking plaster. He chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound. "Well, you've certainly done that. Let's see how long it lasts." He sauntered off, leaving Olivia feeling smaller and more exposed than ever, a specimen under the harsh, fluorescent lights of the unforgiving corporate world. It was exactly 10:17 a.m. when the email arrived. The subject line was stark, devoid of any emotional buffer. Meeting request. It was from Victor's executive assistant, a woman so efficient she seemed to communicate solely through clipped, one-sentence directives. "Mr. Vance would like to see you in his office. Now." Olivia's blood ran cold. This was it. The summons. Her hands felt clammy as she pushed back her chair, the squeak of the casters on the polished concrete floor sounding obscenely loud in the suddenly hushed office. The 50-foot walk across the open-plan space to his door felt like a mile-long trek across a barren desert. Every head seemed to turn, every pair of eyes followed her progress. She could feel their speculation, their pity, their morbid curiosity. Her mind raced, a frantic Rolodex of apologies and justifications, each one more pathetic than the last. "It was a mistake. I sent it to the wrong person. It was a joke. I was drunk. Please don't fire me. I need this job to afford my tiny, ridiculously expensive flat and my crippling avocado toast habit." By the time she reached the imposing glass door, her heart was a frantic drum solo against her ribs, and her palms were slick with nervous sweat. She raised a trembling hand and knocked, the sound barely a whisper against the thick, soundproofed glass. "Come in," his voice commanded, deep, resonant baritone that carried easily through the door, utterly devoid of warmth. She pushed the door open and stepped inside, feeling the atmosphere shift instantly. His office was an extension of his personality, immaculate, minimalist, and brutally efficient. A vast mahogany desk stood pristine and uncluttered, save for a sleek laptop and a single leather-bound notebook. The floor-to-ceiling windows behind him framed a breathtaking, postcard-perfect view of London from the tower, bridged to the distant arch of Wembley, but the man himself commanded all the attention. Victor Vance sat perfectly still, his hands steepled before him, his gaze sharp and analytical. He was exactly as she had described him in the voice note, and the realization sent a fresh wave of heat crawling up her neck. The suit was perfect, the jawline was infuriatingly sharp, and his eyes, a startlingly intense shade of grey, were fixed on her, making her feel like a flawed data point he was about to delete. "Parker," he said, his voice level. "Sit." She sat, perching on the edge of the chair opposite him, her back ramrod straight. She braced herself for the inevitable, for the termination speech, for the public humiliation. Instead, he slid a thick file across the polished surface of the desk. "This is Project Titan," he announced, his tone all business. "It's the most critical initiative for the company this fiscal year. Our largest client is on the line, and the board wants a new strategic direction pitched in 4 weeks. Your preliminary data on the Gen Z demographic was adequate. You'll be working on it. With me. Solely." Olivia stared at him, utterly bewildered. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Fire her? He was promoting her to the inner circle of hell. "You'll report directly to me. We start immediately." There was no mention of the voice note, not a flicker of amusement, not a hint of anger. It was as if it had never happened. The sheer, terrifying normalcy of it was the most disorienting thing of all. Olivia returned to her desk in a complete daze, her mind reeling. She felt like she'd been pulled from the path of a speeding bus, only to be placed directly onto a high-speed train bound for an unknown and likely terrifying destination. The office gossip, which had been a low murmur, now crescendoed into a confused buzz. Why was the office screw-up being assigned to the company's most vital project? Why was the Ice King himself choosing her as his sole partner? She collapsed into her chair, her thoughts a tangled mess of relief, confusion, and a new, more potent form of dread. She was on thin ice before. Now she was dangling over the entire Arctic Ocean by a single fraying thread. Absent-mindedly, she picked up her phone to text Sarah an incoherent update, her thumb hovering over their chat history. And that's when she saw it. Below the disastrous voice note from yesterday, a small gray text notification sent a jolt of pure horror through her system, far worse than the initial panic. Victor Vance saved this message to camera roll. He had saved it. He had downloaded the audio file, the permanent digital record of her professional suicide, onto his personal device. The question wasn't just why he hadn't fired her anymore. The question was why he was keeping the evidence. Was it blackmail? A constant, unspoken reminder of her foolishness that he could hold over her head? A piece of ammunition to be deployed at the most devastating moment. The initial relief of keeping her job evaporated, replaced by the chilling certainty that she wasn't just working with her boss. She was working with her potential executioner. Their first official project meeting took place later that afternoon, in a small, sterile conference room that felt more like an interrogation cell. The air between them was thick with everything left unsaid, a palpable tension that made it hard to breathe. Olivia was determined to project an aura of flawless professionalism to prove that she was more than her mortifying mistake. She arrived 5 minutes early with a freshly printed agenda, her best notebook, and a sensible, non-fluffy black pen. Victor was already there, of course, a spreadsheet of color-coded deadlines and key performance indicators glowing on the large monitor. He didn't acknowledge her arrival beyond a curt nod. "The objective," he began, his voice clipping through the silence, "is to develop a comprehensive marketing strategy that increases user engagement by 40% within 6 months. The methodology will be data-driven, precise, and systematic. There is no room for error." He spoke with the cold, irrefutable logic of a machine, outlining a rigid framework that felt suffocatingly corporate. In an act of subconscious rebellion, Olivia clicked the top of her emergency pen, a bright pink, ridiculously fluffy one she kept in her bag, and began to sketch a sprawling mind map in her notebook. Connecting ideas with looping arrows and bubbly question marks, she felt his gaze on her, a silent, weighty judgment of her chaotic methods. The clash between them was immediate and profound, a battle of spreadsheet versus sketchbook, of rigid order versus creative chaos, all playing out over the unspoken radioactive crater of the voice note. The days that followed blurred into a grueling montage of long hours and forced proximity. Late nights in the deserted office became their new normal, the city lights twinkling below them like a galaxy of fallen stars. The silence of the empty floor amplified every rustle of paper, every keystroke, every strained syllable exchanged between them. During one particularly arduous session, with the clock on the wall creeping past 11, the truce of professional silence was broken by the mundane reality of human need. "We should order food," Olivia declared, her stomach rumbling loud enough to be its own agenda item. Victor looked up from his laptop, his expression unreadable. "Fine," he conceded, as if admitting a strategic weakness. The ensuing debate over takeout became a proxy war for their entire dynamic. "There is a pizzeria with a 4.8-star rating that can deliver within 30 minutes, he stated, all pragmatic efficiency. "Perfect," Olivia said, pulling up the menu on her phone. "I'll have the Hawaiian." Victor's face registered a flicker of something akin to genuine horror. "Pineapple," he said, the word leaving his lips as if it were a foul curse. "Fruit does not belong on a pizza, Parker. It's an abomination." Olivia, sensing the first crack in his formal armor, leaned into it. "It's a perfect blend of sweet and savory. It's culinary genius. Don't tell me a man of your supposed strategic brilliance can't appreciate a little calculated risk." The argument was utterly ridiculous, but it was the most human conversation they had ever had. For a few brief minutes, they weren't just the impossibly demanding boss and his mortified subordinate. They were just two tired people arguing about pizza. As the nights wore on, their witty sparring became a strange sort of rhythm, a way to navigate the treacherous territory of their forced collaboration. They were polar opposites, and the friction between his logic and her creativity often sparked unexpected ideas. He would build an impenetrable fortress of data, and she would find a secret creative door he had never considered. "The data indicates our target consumer. He values security and reliability above all else," he would insist, pointing to a complex graph on the screen, his voice the low, certain baritone that filled the quiet office. "So our slogan needs to reflect that. Something like Nexus, the foundation of your future." Olivia would groan, slumping over her notebook. "Victor, that sounds like an ad for a retirement home or adult diapers. We need something that doesn't sound like it was written by a robot with a thesaurus." She would instantly regret her unfiltered retort, bracing for his icy disapproval. But instead of a reprimand, there would be a long, considering silence. "Propose an alternative," he would challenge, his grey eyes fixed on her, not with anger, but with a kind of demanding curiosity. It was in these moments, buried under piles of market research and takeout containers, that a fragile, grudging respect began to form between them. He was infuriatingly rigid, but his mind was undeniably brilliant. She was chaotic and occasionally unprofessional, but she had a knack for seeing the human element hidden within his cold, hard data. One evening, deep in a frustrating brainstorming session, they hit a wall. Every idea felt stale, every tagline a rehash of something a competitor had already done. Olivia, exhausted and frustrated, leaned back in her chair and stared at the ceiling. "You know, this feels like trying to solve a Rubik's Cube in the dark. We keep twisting it the same way, but all we're getting is a jumbled mess." She let out a sigh. "Okay, fine. So my last idea, innovate or evaporate, might have been a bit dramatic. Sounds more like a threat than a tagline, doesn't it? A bit join us or die." She made the comment to herself more than to him, a bit of self-deprecating humor to break the tension. She expected him to ignore it, to redirect back to the data with a stern comment. But when she glanced over at him, she saw something extraordinary. For a fleeting, almost imperceptible second, the corner of his meticulously controlled mouth twitched upwards. His eyes, usually so serious and analytical, held a distinct gleam of amusement. It was the ghost of a smile, a phantom expression that vanished as quickly as it had appeared, his face immediately resetting to its default stoic mask. But Olivia had seen it. It was a tiny crack in the marble facade, a brief glimpse of the man behind the intimidating title. The moment passed, the heavy silence returning. But for Olivia, it was a small, significant victory, a sign that somewhere beneath the layers of perfectionism and authority, Victor Vance was actually human. The grueling hours continued to mount, the pressure of the impending deadline a constant, oppressive weight on their shoulders. Their shared space, once an arena of awkwardness and tension, began to feel like a self-contained world, a bubble of late-night work sessions and shared intellectual challenges. The rest of the office faded into the background. It was just the two of them and Project Titan. Olivia found herself, much to her own surprise, being awed by the sheer power of Victor's intellect. He could dissect a market trend, identify a potential pitfall, and formulate a multi-stage counter-strategy with a speed and precision that was nothing short of breathtaking. In turn, Victor, though he would never admit it aloud, began to rely on Olivia's creative instincts. He started to listen when she argued for a more emotionally resonant campaign, even if the data wasn't conclusive. "People aren't spreadsheets, Victor," she argued one night, pushing a storyboard sketch across the table. "They make decisions based on feeling, on connection. We need to tell a story, not just present a value proposition." He had studied her sketch for a long time, his expression unreadable before giving a single, curt nod. "Develop it further," he'd said. It was the highest form of praise she had yet received from him, and it felt more validating than any fawning compliment from anyone else. The professional respect growing between them did little to ease the personal tension, however. It only made it more complex. Every brief, accidental brush of their hands as they reached for the same document sent a jolt of electricity through the air. Every time she caught him looking at her with that intense, analytical gaze, she wondered if he was thinking about the project, or about her ridiculous, mortifying description of him, the unspoken knowledge of... The voice note was always there, a third entity in the room, a ghost at their work sessions. The memory of her own words, devastatingly, infuriatingly hot, would echo in her mind at the most inopportune moments, like when he rolled up his sleeves to reveal strong forearms, or when he leaned over her shoulder to point at something on her screen, his clean, crisp scent enveloping her for a moment. It was a unique form of torture, a constant, low-level hum of attraction and humiliation that made her head spin. She was becoming more and more fascinated by the man she was supposed to be terrified of, and the combination was as intoxicating as it was dangerous. They were finally packing up after another marathon session, the first hints of dawn painting the sky outside in shades of grey and lavender. The office was eerily silent, the only sound the soft zip of their laptop bags. Olivia felt a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. They had made a significant breakthrough on the campaign's core concept, a small victory that felt monumental. She slung her bag over her shoulder, ready to face the commute home and collapse into bed. "Good work tonight, Parker," Victor said, his voice surprisingly soft in the quiet of the pre-dawn office. The simple acknowledgement sent a warmth spreading through her chest. "You too," she replied, a genuine smile touching her lips for the first time in what felt like days. She was at the door, her hand on the handle, when his voice stopped her. "One more thing." He paused, and the air in the room instantly crackled, the fragile camaraderie of the last few hours shattering into a million pieces. The silence stretched, taut and agonizing. Olivia's heart, which had just been settling into a calm rhythm, began to hammer against her ribs again. Her blood ran cold. This was it. After all this time, after all the work, he was finally going to bring it up. The voice note. The end of the world was not, it seemed, going to be a dramatic explosion, but a quiet, formal execution in a deserted office at dawn. Olivia's breath caught in her throat, her entire body frozen in a state of high alert. The silence in the pre-dawn office was absolute, a perfect vacuum in which Victor's two words, "one more," echoed with the deafening finality of a judge's sentence. Her mind, a whirlwind of panic, conjured a dozen different ways he could say it, each more humiliating than the last. Would he play the voice note aloud, forcing her to listen to her own giddy, drunken voice professing his hotness? Would he formally reprimand her, his words as sharp and precise as a scalpel, dissecting her unprofessionalism in excruciating detail? He turned from the door to face her fully, his expression unreadable in the dim light. His grey eyes met hers, and for a heart-stopping moment, she was certain this was the end. "The data visualization on slide 74 of the appendix," he stated, his voice a low, even baritone that betrayed no emotion whatsoever. The y-axis is improperly labeled. It creates a minor but notable statistical ambiguity. Fix it before you circulate the draft." And with that, he turned, gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod, and walked out, his footsteps echoing down the empty corridor, leaving Olivia standing alone by the door, her heart still pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. It was a reprieve, but it was not a pardon. The anticlimax left her breathless, a confusing mix of overwhelming relief and a new, unsettling sense of dread. He hadn't brought up the voice note, but he had, in his own way, reasserted his absolute control. He was reminding her that he saw everything, every tiny flaw, every mistake. The unspoken message was clear. She was under a microscope, and he would not miss a single detail. In the week that followed, their working dynamic settled into a strange and precarious new rhythm. The initial, excruciating awkwardness began to fade, replaced by a kind of hyper-focused, professional truce. They were a team, bound not by camaraderie, but by the shared immense pressure of Project Titan. The unspoken rule, never ever mention the voice note, remained firmly in place, a solid wall of denial between them. Yet, small cracks began to appear in their respective armors. Olivia's bright pink fluffy pen became a silent symbol of their ongoing Cold War of personalities. She would leave it on his pristine, minimalist desk at the end of a session, a tiny, defiant splash of chaos in his world of perfect order. The first few times, she would find it placed neatly back on her own desk the next morning. Then, one day, she arrived to find it sitting exactly where she had left it, an absurd pink exclamation point next to his sleek silver laptop. He never said a word, but its presence felt like a concession, a tiny, unspoken acknowledgement of her existence beyond her function as a project associate. During one brainstorming session, her chaotic mind map and his rigid dataset finally clicked together in a moment of pure synergy. "What if," she had mused, tapping the pen against her chin, "we don't sell it as a product, but as a sidekick, a reliable best friend for your digital life? The data says people want security, but what they crave is companionship." Victor had gone utterly still, his eyes fixed on her sprawling, messy diagram. "A sidekick," he repeated slowly, the word sounding foreign in his formal cadence. "Correlate that emotional concept with our engagement data, Parker, now." It was the first time her chaos hadn't just been tolerated, it had been commanded. Olivia began to notice other inconsistencies, tiny details that didn't align with the cold, robotic executive persona Victor so carefully projected. She arrived exceptionally early one morning, hoping to get a head start on a new set of analytics, and found him already at his desk. For a moment, he didn't see her. He was staring out the window, but his focus wasn't on the sprawling city below. On his desk, placed incongruously beside a thick stack of financial reports, was a worn, dog-eared paperback copy of Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude. It seemed so profoundly out of place in his sterile, data-driven world, a relic of passionate, messy, magical realism in a citadel of logic. She saw him reach out and trace the title with one long finger, his expression unguarded for a fraction of a second, revealing a deep, almost melancholic introspection that startled her. The moment he sensed her presence, the mask slammed back into place. The book was swiftly and discreetly swept into his briefcase, his face reverting to its usual impassive, businesslike state. "Parker," he acknowledged with a curt nod, his attention already on the glowing screen of his laptop. But Olivia couldn't shake the image. It was another clue, another piece of the puzzle that was Victor Vance, hinting at a hidden depth, a soul that might understand. Solitude and epic, sprawling stories, a man far more complex than the walking statue she had so flippantly described. The mystery deepened a few nights later. They were working against a tight deadline for a preliminary review, and the office was, as usual, deserted save for the two of them. Victor stepped away to take a call, his voice a low, urgent murmur as he paced down the hallway. While he was gone, Olivia noticed a sheet of thick drawing paper had slipped from his leather notebook and fallen onto the floor beside his chair. Thinking it was a stray project note, she bent to pick it up. It wasn't a spreadsheet or a graph, it was a sketch, a beautifully rendered professional quality illustration of a small rabbit in a tweed waistcoat and spectacles, looking up at a giant friendly-faced moon. The detail was exquisite, the character imbued with a whimsical charm that was so completely at odds with Victor's personality that Olivia felt a dizzying sense of cognitive dissonance. This wasn't corporate strategy, this was the page of a children's book. Her mind reeled with questions. As she stared at the drawing, utterly captivated, she heard his footsteps returning. In a panic, she dropped the paper back onto the floor just as he re-entered the room. He saw the drawing instantly, his eyes narrowing. Without a word, he swooped down, snatched the paper, and tucked it swiftly back into his notebook, his movements sharp and guarded. He didn't offer an explanation, and the sudden, intense severity in his expression forbade her from asking for one. The rest of the evening, the air was thick with a new kind of tension. The silence charged not with awkwardness, but with the weight of a secret she had accidentally brushed up against. A critical Saturday work session was scheduled to finalize the framework for their pitch. Punctuality was, for Victor, a cardinal virtue. He was a man who seemed to operate on a timeline synchronized with the atomic clock. So when 10 o'clock came and went with no sign of him, Olivia was first annoyed, then confused. She sent a polite, professionally worded email. "Just checking you are still planning to come in." No response. 11 o'clock crept by. The vast, sun-drenched office felt unnervingly empty, her annoyance slowly curdling into a strange, unfamiliar sliver of worry. This was not like him. He would never miss a critical meeting without a clear, concise explanation delivered well in advance. She tried to work, but her focus was shot, her thoughts continually drifting to the inconsistencies she had observed. The book, the drawing, and now this uncharacteristic absence. The man who demanded perfect control from everyone around him seemed to be losing his own. It was unsettling, like watching a perfectly straight line suddenly begin to waver, and for reasons she couldn't quite articulate, it made her deeply uneasy. By midday, unable to concentrate, Olivia decided to abandon the office and grab a proper coffee. There was a small independent cafe she liked, located on a side street, not far from St. Thomas's Hospital, which she knew was roughly on the path Victor would take if he were commuting from the south. It was a silly, tenuous connection, but she needed a change of scenery. She was leaving the cafe, a warm cup in her hand, when a familiar figure across the street caught her eye, stopping her dead in her tracks. It was Victor. He was standing near the main entrance of the hospital, but he was not the Victor Vance she knew. The perfectly tailored suit was gone, replaced by simple dark jeans and a plain grey sweater. His posture, usually so ramrod straight and commanding, was stooped, weary. His corporate armor had vanished, and in its place was a raw, unguarded vulnerability that was profoundly shocking. He was just a man, staring up at the imposing, sterile facade of the hospital with an expression of such profound exhaustion and bone-deep sorrow that it stole the breath from Olivia's lungs. He ran a hand through his usually immaculate hair, messing it up, looking lost and terribly alone. He hadn't seen her. Overwhelmed by a sense she was intruding on something intensely private, something sacred and painful, Olivia instinctively ducked behind a parked van, her heart pounding in her chest with a confusing, chaotic mix of shock, empathy, and a sudden, fierce urge to understand. The image of Victor standing outside the hospital was seared into Olivia's mind. It replayed itself over and over throughout the rest of the weekend, a haunting loop that completely recontextualized every interaction they had ever had. His relentless perfectionism, his demanding nature, his emotional distance. She had always interpreted it as arrogance, as the entitled behavior of a brilliant executive who couldn't be bothered with lesser mortals. Now, she saw it for what it was, a shield. It was a suit of armor, meticulously crafted and maintained to protect something fragile and wounded underneath. The man who insisted on absolute control at the office was clearly dealing with a situation in his personal life that was utterly, terrifyingly out of his control. Her feelings toward him underwent a seismic shift. The fear and resentment she had harbored since the voice note incident dissolving into a wave of profound, aching empathy. The project, their looming deadline, her own career anxieties, it all suddenly seemed secondary. For the first time, she wasn't just thinking about how to survive working with Victor Vance. She was thinking about the man himself and the secret burden he was so clearly carrying all alone. The office on Monday morning was a minefield of renewed tension. Olivia felt as if she knew a secret she was never meant to know, and the knowledge made it impossible to act normally. She was in the break room, trying to will the coffee machine to work faster, when George Ballard materialized beside her, his presence as welcome as a tax. Audit, he leaned against the counter, a smug, predatory grin plastered on his face. "You and Vance are spending a lot of time together after hours," he began, his voice a low, insinuating drawl. "Burning the midnight oil. I have to say, Parker, it's a very dedicated approach to climbing the corporate ladder." Olivia's grip tightened around her coffee mug. "It's called working on a high-stakes project, George. You should try it sometime." His grin widened. "Oh, I'm sure it is. Just be careful. HR can be very particular about fraternization, especially between senior directors and their junior associates. It would be a terrible shame if someone got the wrong impression about how you landed such a coveted spot on Project Titan." The threat, veiled though it was, hung in the air between them, as clear and chilling as a shard of ice. He was not just watching them. He was building a case, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Victor finally arrived at the office just before 10, his corporate armor firmly back in place. He was dressed in a razor-sharp navy suit, his hair perfect, his expression an impenetrable mask of authority. But Olivia, now seeing him through a new lens, could detect the faint, telltale signs of exhaustion etched around his eyes, the subtle tension in his jaw. He walked straight to her desk, ignoring the curious stares of their colleagues. "Ms. Parker," he said, his voice low and formal, "my apologies for my absence on Saturday. There was a personal matter that required my immediate attention." The words were a wall, a formal, corporate-approved excuse designed to deflect any and all questions. But where she once would have heard only cold dismissal, Olivia now heard the profound vulnerability he was trying so desperately to conceal. She looked up at him, meeting his guarded grey eyes, and for the first time, she didn't feel intimidated. "I understand," she said softly, her voice filled with a sincerity that seemed to surprise him. "I hope everything is okay." His composure flickered for the briefest of moments, a barely perceptible crack in the marble facade, before he simply nodded and retreated to the sanctuary of his office. That evening, as they were wrapping up their work, the atmosphere was different. The witty banter was gone, replaced by a quiet, fragile tension. They worked in a shared silence that was no longer awkward, but filled with the weight of things unsaid. As Olivia was packing her bag, she decided to take a risk, a small step into the fiercely guarded territory of his personal life. "Victor," she began, using his first name for the first time without the shield of a joke. He paused, his back to her, as he stared out the floor-to-ceiling window at the river of headlights flowing through the dark city. I hope whatever you're dealing with gets better." She expected him to shut her down, to retreat behind his wall of formal professionalism. Instead, he remained silent for a long moment, his reflection a stark silhouette against the glittering London skyline. "Sometimes he said finally, his voice so low she had to strain to hear it. The most important strategies have nothing to do with work. He turned his head slightly, though not enough to meet her eyes. You have to protect your priorities, Parker, at all costs. It was vague, an echo of the conversation she'd imagined, but it was also a confession. It was the most honest, most personal thing he had ever said to her. A small, fragile bridge built across the vast chasm that separated them. In that moment, the professional barrier between them was irrevocably and permanently breached. The change in their dynamic was subtle but profound. An unspoken understanding now existed between them, a shared awareness of the stakes that went far beyond the success of Project Titan. Olivia found herself becoming fiercely protective of him, in a professional sense. She worked with a renewed intensity, anticipating problems, smoothing over logistical snags, and taking on more of the workload without being asked, wanting to ease his burden in the only way she knew how. The witty banter eventually returned, but it was softer now, the sharp edges worn away, replaced by a gentle teasing that was tinged with a new layer of warmth and genuine care. He, in turn, began to trust her instincts more implicitly, giving her more autonomy and creative freedom than she ever thought possible. He was still demanding, still a perfectionist, but his critiques were now framed as collaborative challenges rather than unilateral commands. They were becoming true partners, their contrasting styles no longer a source of conflict, but a source of strength, each of them compensating for the other's weaknesses. This new partnership was put on public display during a high-pressure progress meeting with the heads of several other departments. George Ballard, ever the opportunist, was in attendance, and he seized a moment to try and undermine their work. While the creative direction is certainly novel, George began, a condescending smirk on his face as he addressed the room. The timeline for implementation presented by Ms. Parker seems ambitious, perhaps overly so. There are significant logistical hurdles you haven't accounted for. Olivia opened her mouth to defend their carefully constructed plan, but before she could utter a single word, Victor cut in, his voice as cold and sharp as breaking ice. On the contrary, George, he said, fixing him with a stare that could freeze lava. He then proceeded to systematically dismantle George's point with a barrage of facts, figures, and logistical projections, his strategic mind working with breathtaking speed and precision. He concluded by looking not at George, but at the senior vice president chairing the meeting. Ms. Parker's creative timeline is aggressive because it needs to be. It is what will give us the decisive competitive edge in a crowded market. We are confident in its viability. It was the first time he had ever publicly and proactively defended her methods, and not just defended them, but championed them as essential. It was a clear, unambiguous statement to everyone in the room. They were a united front. An attack on her was an attack on him. The pressure continued to build as they approached the final pre-investor review, a critical dress rehearsal for their ultimate pitch. Everything had to be perfect. They scheduled their most important late-night session yet, a final marathon effort to polish the presentation until it gleamed. The success or failure of the entire project hinged on this last push. Olivia was at her desk, organizing her notes, her stomach a knot of nervous energy, when her phone buzzed on the desk beside her. She glanced at the screen. It was a text message from Victor. This, in itself, was an anomaly. Their communication was almost exclusively confined to corporate email or face-to-face conversation. Her heart skipped a beat as she read the stark, formal words on the screen. It said simply, "Something has come up. A family emergency. I am sorry. I cannot make it tonight." The message was as cryptic as it was alarming. The words, "family emergency," coming from a man as guarded and private as Victor, hit Olivia with the force of a physical blow. She was left sitting alone in the vast, silent, and suddenly intimidating office. The immense weight of their make-or-break project. Settling squarely on her shoulders, her mind filled not with professional annoyance or panic, but with a deep, profound, and aching worry for the man she was only just beginning to understand. The stark finality of Victor's text message left Olivia feeling as though the floor had dropped out from beneath her. She sat alone in the cavernous, silent office, the city lights outside twinkling with an indifferent beauty. The weight of Project Titan, once a shared burden, now settled squarely and suffocatingly upon her shoulders. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle at the edges of her resolve. She tried to focus on the intricate details of their pitch deck, but her mind was a tumultuous storm of worry. Every potential scenario she imagined for Victor's family emergency was more harrowing than the last, each one colored by the haunting image of his sorrowful face outside the hospital. Hours bled into one another. As she clicked through their shared project folder on the company server, a small nagging detail caught her eye. She checked the access logs, a feature she normally ignored. According to the timestamp, someone had accessed their primary research file just an hour ago, long after everyone else, including her, had left for the day. The user ID was not hers, nor was it Victor's. It was George Ballard's. A cold dread, far more tangible than her earlier anxiety, washed over her. It was one thing for him to make threats in the break room. It was another. A thing entirely to be snooping around their most critical files after hours. The following morning, her worst fears were realized. She arrived at the office to find Victor already there, his face pale and drawn, the faint stubble on his jaw, a testament to a sleepless, agonizing night. Before she could even ask if he was okay, he was beckoning her grimly towards a conference room. "There's a problem," he said, his voice strained. On the main screen was their pitch deck, but it was a corrupted, broken version of what they had built. Key slides were missing, and the foundational market analysis file, the very bedrock of their entire strategy, had been completely wiped, replaced by a file that was unreadable. The pre-investor review, scheduled for that afternoon, was a catastrophe. They presented a patched-together, anemic version of their work, and the feedback was brutal. They were told their data was unsubstantiated, their conclusions weak. The project was put on indefinite hold, a corporate euphemism for a slow and certain death. The humiliation was a physical weight, pressing down on Olivia, but it was eclipsed by the look of quiet devastation on Victor's face. He looked like a general who had just watched his entire army get wiped from the field. The fallout was immediate and severe. They were summoned to a tense, closed-door meeting with the head of their division. Olivia was prepared to explain her suspicion about George Ballard, to show the server logs she had screenshot the night before. But before she could speak, Victor stepped forward, his posture rigid, his face a mask of grim resolve. "The security of the project files was my ultimate responsibility," he stated, his voice devoid of any emotion. "I was dealing with a personal matter that took my focus away from my duties. The failure to protect our intellectual property and the subsequent failure of the preliminary review is mine, and mine alone." Olivia stared at him, aghast. He was taking the fall, all of it. He was protecting her from any insinuation of incompetence, shielding her from the political shrapnel. The division head, a stern woman named Eleanor, looked at him with a mixture of disappointment and respect. "Your record has been exemplary until now, Victor," she said coolly, "but this is a major failure. We'll have to reconsider your oversight on future Tier 1 projects. A demotion is not off the table." The word hung in the air, a death knell for the career he had so meticulously built. As they left the office, Olivia was drowning in a tidal wave of guilt, the weight of his sacrifice a crushing burden. Later that day, she found him in his office, standing by the window, looking out at the grey, indifferent city. "Why did you do that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I saw the logs." I know it was George. We could have told her." Victor turned to face her, his eyes dark with an exhaustion that seemed to seep from his very soul. "And what would that have looked like, Parker? An unsubstantiated accusation from a junior associate on a failing project? It would have been dismissed as a desperate attempt to shift blame. Ballard would deny it, and we would look weak and paranoid." He let out a long, slow breath. This was the only strategic move, a controlled retreat. Olivia shook her head, tears of frustration stinging her eyes. "This is my fault," she choked out, the words she had been holding back finally spilling forth. "All of it. The voice note, the way I made us a target for George's ambition. If I had just been more professional from the start, none of this would have happened." He crossed the room and stood before her, his presence intense. "Ballard's lack of integrity is not your fault," he said, his voice firm, cutting through her self-recrimination. "And my personal situation made me distracted. I dropped the ball. This is on me." It was not an absolution, but it was a refusal to let her carry the blame, a gesture of partnership so profound it made her heart ache. That night, sleep was an impossibility. Olivia lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. The old project, the one they had poured their lives into for weeks, felt tainted, broken. Trying to fix it now felt like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. The words of their division head, unsubstantiated, weak, echoed in her ears. She thought about Victor taking the blame, about the potential demotion he was facing to protect her. Fierce, protective anger began to bubble up inside her, eclipsing her guilt. She had been trying so hard to fit into Victor's world, to play by the corporate rules, to be the person she thought they wanted her to be, and for what? To be sabotaged and defeated. In a sudden, blinding flash of clarity, she knew what she had to do. She wasn't a data-driven strategist. She was a storyteller, a creative, and she was going to fight back in the only way she knew how. She threw back the covers, her heart pounding with a new, terrifying purpose. She went to her laptop and created a new file, titling it Project Titan, The Real Pitch. She scrapped everything, the data, the graphs, the corporate jargon, fueled by a potent combination of coffee, adrenaline, and righteous fury. She worked through the night, building a completely new campaign from the ashes of their old one, a campaign based on her sidekick idea, on emotion, on chaos, on her authentic voice. It was bold, it was a massive risk, and it felt more right than anything she had ever done. The next morning, the day of the company's annual awards gala, where the project was supposed to be triumphantly unveiled, she intercepted Victor near his office, her hands trembling as she held out her tablet. "I have something to show you," she said, her voice breathless. "I reworked the entire pitch. It's different. He was already shaking his head, his face a grim mask of resignation as he prepared for the public fallout. He barely glanced at the screen. "Parker, it's too late," he said, his voice weary. "The decision has been made. We go out there, we present the recovery plan Eleanor approved, and we take our lumps. Don't make it worse." His dismissal, pragmatic as it was, felt like a slap. He didn't even have the energy left to fight. She was standing at a crossroads. She could be the obedient subordinate, follow his orders and go down with the sinking ship. Or she could commit career suicide on a grand public stage, fighting for her idea, for their work, for him. She looked at the man standing before her, a brilliant general ready to surrender, and made her choice. She would not let him. The gala was a glittering, cacophonous affair held in a grand ballroom overlooking the Thames. The air hummed with forced laughter and the clinking of champagne glasses. To Olivia, it felt like a funeral. Their project was the last major presentation of the evening, the grand finale that was now destined to be a cautionary tale. George Ballard was circulating through the crowd, looking impossibly smug, accepting condolences for their project's failure with a disgusting display of false sympathy. When their time slot was announced, Olivia felt a wave of nausea. She walked toward the stage, clutching a simple USB drive in her sweaty palm, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was it. She was about to either save both their careers or become the most infamous cautionary tale in Nexus Innovations history. There would be no in-between. She stood at the podium, the glare of the spotlight blinding her to the hundreds of faces in the audience. The approved recovery plan presentation was loaded on the screen behind her. She took a deep, shuddering breath, looked out into the darkness where she knew Victor was watching, and made her move. "Good evening," she began, her voice shaking but clear. "The presentation loaded behind me is a safe one. It is a logical, data-driven plan for mitigating a disaster. But I am not going to present it." A confused murmur rippled through the ballroom. She clicked the button on her remote, and her own presentation, vibrant and alive with her digital sidekick concept, flashed onto the screen. "Data is important," she said, her confidence growing with every word. "It tells us the what, but it never tells us the why. Data doesn't have a heart. Stories do. Our strategy isn't about selling a product. It's about offering a partnership, a reliable friend in a chaotic, digital world." She launched into her pitch, a passionate, heartfelt, and completely unorthodox narrative that captivated the stunned silence of the room. She spoke of connection, of vulnerability, of how technology could ease the burden of modern loneliness. It was the best work she had ever done. When she finished, there was a moment of profound silence, the kind that could either precede a standing ovation or a summary execution. It was the company's CEO, a formidable man named Mr. Davenport, who broke it. He stood up, his expression one of deep skepticism. "Ms. Parker," he said, his voice amplified by the room's speakers, "while your passion is evident, this is not the strategy we were briefed on. It seems highly sentimental and lacks the empirical backing we require for a Tier 1 investment. It is, frankly, a risk we cannot afford." George Ballard's smirk was a triumphant slash in the crowd. This was it, the final nail in her coffin. But then, a figure moved from the side of the room. Victor. He walked calmly and deliberately onto the stage and took the second microphone, his presence commanding the absolute attention of everyone in the ballroom. The room, which had begun to whisper, fell utterly silent. "For weeks," Victor began, his voice calm and resonant, filled with an unshakable conviction, "I tried to force this project into a rigid, conventional box. I was wrong." He turned and looked directly at Olivia, and in his eyes, she saw not a boss, not a director, but a partner, his gaze filled with a profound and public respect that made her breath catch. "Ms. Parker's approach," he continued, his voice ringing with clarity, "is chaotic, unpredictable, and it is the only reason we have a chance to succeed. She taught me that the best ideas, the truly revolutionary ones, don't always come from a spreadsheet." He then turned his steely gaze back towards the CEO and George Ballard. "Furthermore, the reason our initial pitch failed was not due to a lack of our data, but due to sabotage. Our foundational research was illegally accessed and deliberately corrupted on the evening of September 1st. He gestured to the tech booth, and I have the server logs to prove it. On the giant screen behind them, an image of the server log appeared with George Ballard's user ID and the timestamp highlighted in a damning shade of red. A collective gasp swept through the room. Victor had not been preparing for a surrender. He had been preparing for an counterattack. The aftermath was as swift as it was decisive. Faced with irrefutable proof of corporate espionage and captivated by the bold new direction, the CEO and the board voted unanimously to greenlight Olivia's pitch, backed by the company's largest ever investment. George Ballard was unceremoniously fired and escorted from the premises by security, his smug expression finally replaced by one of pure, unadulterated panic. The rest of the gala was a blur for Olivia. She was surrounded by colleagues, now offering genuine congratulations, their respect hard-won on a public stage, but she barely heard them. Her focus was on finding Victor. She finally spotted him standing alone by the vast windows overlooking the glittering, inky blackness of the Thames, the celebration continuing behind him. She walked over, her heart full of 1,000 unspoken questions, and a gratitude so immense it felt like it might burst from her chest. He turned as she approached, a small, tired smile on his face. "You were brilliant," he said, his voice quiet, for her ears only. "I knew you would be." She shook her head, still in disbelief. "I don't understand. You had the proof all along. Why did you take the blame?" He looked out at the river for a long moment before answering. "Because my sister was in the hospital, and I wasn't there for you or for the project. That part was my failure. I couldn't in good conscience use Ballard's crime to excuse my own lapse. I owed you that. I had to let you have your moment to succeed on your own terms, not just as a reaction to his failure." And then finally, he gave her the missing piece of the puzzle. "I have a younger sister, Chloe," he began, his voice softening with an unmistakable tenderness. "She has a chronic illness, a rare form of juvenile arthritis. She's had it since she was a kid. That night, she had a relapse. A bad one. That's where I was. The hospital, the drawings. They're for her. She wants to be an illustrator." Finally looked at her, his grey eyes completely unguarded, stripped of all their armor. "I've built my entire career on being impenetrable because I was terrified anyone would see my distraction, my life outside of work, as a weakness. I thought I had to be a machine to be respected." Olivia felt a profound wave of understanding wash over her, everything clicking into place. The solitude, the control, the hidden gentleness. It was all a defense mechanism for a heart that was already carrying the heaviest burden imaginable. She reached out, her fingers gently touching his arm. "Being a caregiver, loving someone that much, isn't a weakness, Victor," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "It's a superpower." The tension that had defined their relationship for so long, the awkwardness, the fear, the misperceptions, finally dissolved, replaced by a current of profound, genuine connection. And then he smiled, a real, warm, breathtakingly beautiful smile that reached his eyes. "So," he said, a glint of pure amusement dancing in their grey depths, "a walking statue of a Greek god, was it? With a penchant for judging font choices?" A shocked laugh escaped Olivia's lips. She groaned, burying her face in her hands, her cheeks burning, but she was laughing with him. The voice note, the source of her deepest humiliation, was suddenly, miraculously, just a funny story. It was the beginning, their beginning. 3 months later, Olivia Parker, now a newly minted project lead, stood in her new, larger office, looking out at the same view from a slightly higher floor. The imposter syndrome that had plagued her for years was gone, replaced by a quiet, hard-earned confidence. Her desk was a creative, organized mess, and on the corner of it a bright pink fluffy pen sat proudly in a pot. Her phone buzzed on the desk, a notification popped up. It was a WhatsApp message from Victor Vance. Her heart did a familiar little flip. It wasn't a text, it was a voice note. A slow smile spread across her face as she lifted the phone to her ear, a delicious sense of irony washing over her. She pressed play. His smooth, deep voice, no longer the icy baritone of the director of strategy, but something warmer, richer, and tinged with a genuine amusement she had come to adore, filled her ear. "Miss Parker, it has come to my attention that I owe you a drink, or several, and I have also been reliably informed that calling is inefficient." A pause. "Will you join me for dinner? On Friday? I believe it's my turn to order the pizza. I'm even willing to entertain the possibility of pineapple." End of message. She laughed, a real, joyful, unrestrained sound that filled her new office. The circle was complete. She hit the button to record her reply, her heart light, her future as bright and glittering as the city skyline in front of her.